Last time on Low Budget Binge.
Knowing my fair share of ancient myths and how they often end in utter tragedy, instead we get machine guns, armed guards, and multiple murders as if this were an 80s Schwarzenegger flick. His prominent brow line always made me feel like he would be a much better bad guy thug type. Processed foods are provided to the couple. When he finally goes Lulu cuckoo, he serves up the ham cooked to perfection. What happens next is the stuff of ancient Greek myth and tragic fairy tale.
And now, the next death-defying chapter of Low Budget Binge.
Welcome back to ML Miller Frights, part of the Kings of Horror Network. I'm ML Miller. While you might be watching this video on the Kings of Horror Network, I urge you to click over to my ML Miller Frights page and give it a like, share with your buddies across the electronic superhighway, click subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. Let's get the word out to new folks so we can make ML Miller Frights, as well as the Kings of Horror Network, bigger and better. Low Budget Binge is where we venture down the path less traveled and look at low budget, no budget, and sometimes international films that never get the top billing you see with the usual Hollywood fare. I'll indicate in the review and down below where you can find these films, along with their trailers. Here we go. Killer Therapy is new on-demand and digital download from 4Digital Media. Director Barry J. seems to have a pretty poor opinion of therapy, as evidenced by the abysmal representation he offers in his film, Killer Therapy, which seems to want to blame the system rather than the individual in terms of criminal and psychotic behavior. Now, I'm not saying there isn't an argument that institutionalization doesn't have its adverse effects on the human psyche, but I don't think this film is helping that case one bit. Killer Therapy follows the tragic life of Brian Langston, played by Jonathan Tyser as a kid, and Michael Olegui as an adult. In and out of psychiatric facilities through most of his life, every time Brian tries to go home and reacquaint himself with a normal life, something happens to toss him back inside a mental hospital with a worse therapist than he had before. As with most kids in the system, Brian runs the gauntlet of therapists, medications, and treatments, and by the time he is of adult age, he doesn't really know anything but the inside of a hospital. Yet he is released and sent home nevertheless. This pretty much encapsulates the first hour of Killer Therapy, but if you read the official synopsis of it, the film seems to want to be called a slasher. Unfortunately, the slasher, serial killer aspects really don't come into play until the last half hour, and most of that takes place within about a 5-minute montage. Needless to say, this isn't your typical slasher, though Brian seems to slip right into slasher territory pretty easily in the last act. Filmmaker Barry J. really seems to want to let the viewer know every minute of abuse, torment, and self-fulfilling prophecy that occurs in Brian's life. Had the final half hour been worth the wait for the real carnage to occur, I would have supported this journey. But the film builds to such a lackluster, cliched, and rushed climax that it really does feel like this filmmaker simply forgot what kind of film they were making. On top of that, the therapy given in this film is either terrible, outdated, or completely simplified. Again, each therapist is introduced, and like a Bond villain, discourses maniacally about the process they are about to put Brian through, which takes a crazy chunk of time. If there was a need for a montage, instead of tossing it at the end for the murder spree, where you need the suspense and the tension, how about a montage of each of the therapists Brian receives? Or have one therapist use a myriad of techniques on Brian to simplify the story? None of that is used. In the end, this is just an overcomplicated mess of a film that overshoots its point with simply too much story to tell, not enough focus, and not enough understanding of how actual therapy works. I had a writing professor once tell me to write a whole backstory for my characters, including a detailed history of what led them to the moment that the story begins. He then said, put that away in a drawer and reference it from time to time in your story, but don't use it as your story. This will enrich your story and make the character much more interesting. I wish the folks behind Killer Therapy would have taken that advice. In the end, Killer Therapy feels more like a Lifetime movie depicting the tragic life of a kid in and out of mental institutions, starring some notable names in horror like P.J. Soles, Adrian King, Tom Matthews, and the kid who played Michael Myers in Rob Zombie's Halloween. Had these actors starred in a real slasher film, I'd be much more impressed, but any slasher elements seem like an afterthought, making the arduous road to the climax not really worth the trip. In the end, on a positive note, Killer Therapy does open on a memorable and effective scene as we are introduced to the young Brian wearing a monster mask. It's a fantastic prelude to the monster Brian will become, and is a wonderful jump scare as well. I only wish the scares would have continued to be as good after that. A Dark Path is new on-demand, digital download, and DVD. After a night of partying hard for a bachelorette party in Eastern Europe, a pair of sisters take a rental car through the countryside to the airport. Unfortunately, they find themselves stranded in a thick forested area with someone or something slinking around in the darkness outside. The opening 10 to 15 minutes of A Dark Path are by far the best. This is where we get to know a bunch of talented actresses, led by McKenna Goyler and Mari Beasley, as two sisters. Goyler's character Abby is the older, more responsible sister who is rumored to have a wild side but rarely shows it. Her younger sister Lily, played by Beasley, is the hellion, constantly urging her older sister to lighten up. While this back and forth gets tired later in the story, the opening scenes are not only great as letting us to know who these girls are and how different they are from one another, but they also feature some genuinely funny lines that had me laughing out loud numerous times. 2 of the 4 members of the group leave after the opener, and I think that's the mistake filmmaker Nicholas Winter makes. I don't know why all 4 of these infectiously fun gals wouldn't be put in a car and forced to take on the evils the 2 sisters will soon face. I get trying to make this an intimate story about 2 sisters becoming closer, but cutting the cast in half after just introducing them simply doesn't make sense, especially when this quartet make for a very fun and genuinely realistic group to follow. Things begin to get cliched pretty early on when a flat tire and no cell service leave Abby and Lily stranded in the woods in the middle of nowhere. The pace of the film, which started out fast and furious, decelerates to a crawl as the characters move cautiously through the woods, discover a pair of other drivers, and stumble upon some kind of sneaking and slobbering creature in the woods surrounding them. This leads to a little cat and mouse, with the group losing each other and then finding each other, only to be offed by the monsters. The plot really slugs along here, and it seems Winter is simply padding the film for feature length at the painfully slow sequences of the gals hiding in the woods from a monster that moves at a pace that's more similar to a turtle. For an hour and 15-minute movie, this one is an arduous trek to take. To seal the deal that this film is going nowhere, A Dark Path features a non-ending that made me so pissed I wish I had never watched it. I know a lot of work was put into this low-budgeter. The acting is above the norm, and I even like the slimy creature effects. But if you don't have a story for your characters and monster to move around in, the whole trip just proves to be futile. And that's what A Dark Path is. A letdown of a film that started so strong. The Last Laugh is new on-demand and digital download from High Octane Pictures. It's directed by Jeremy Berg. Miles, played by Steve Vanderzee, is a struggling comedian looking for his big break. After a particularly brutal set, Miles meets up with his manager, who has good news. Miles is going to open for a big comic at one of the most popular theaters in town. If Miles nails this gig, his career will skyrocket, as there will be a talent scout in the audience. On the night of the show, Miles is suffering from the jitters, and his manager has taken away his meds because he feels this takes the edge off of his performance. It just so happens that a killer in a theatrical comedy mask is murdering various people in the crew. When Miles stumbles across one of the bodies, he's faced with a moral dilemma: report the crime and get the show canceled, or wait until after he goes on to report it and get his big break. Meanwhile, the bodies are beginning to stack higher and higher. I really like the premise of The Last Laugh. The numerous passageways, closets, and curtain-draped rooms make for a locale that suggests the murder could be right around any corner. There's also a fun mystique about the stage and horror that has worked in quite a few horror films, like the Phantom of the Opera films, Stage Fright, Curtains, among others. The kills in The Last Laugh are decent as well, with the killer being quite imposing, walking around in the shadowy corridors. The air of mystery is also pretty thick, as there are a number of people who have motive to don the mask and start killing. That said, this is a film about a comedian, and my main frustration with The Last Laugh is that none of the stand-up is particularly funny. We're given quite a few glimpses of Miles's act, and while there are plenty of people who say he is hilarious, the viewer never really gets to see that hilarity in action. The dialogue is quick and punchy between the cast, but I feel that everyone thinks it's much more clever than it actually is. Miles talks in a fast Sorkin meme speak, but it all comes off more like snarky Twitter speak than something biting or funny. The film continuously sells the viewer that Miles is funny, but never really shows it. What snippets of his actual act we do see are underwritten and lazy. And since the whole story is hinging on whether or not Miles is going to get his big break, not enough time was put into his act and presence to get me to care. Without that investment, the film kind of fell apart for me. The Last Laugh is not a complete waste of time. I really like the dilemma Miles faces as to reveal that there's been a murder or seek the fame that he desires so much. If you're simply looking for some thrilling scenes and a little mystery, it'll fill the bill, but I feel that if a little more work would have been put into the script, it would have been a whole lot better of a film. Evil Boy is new on demand, digital download, and DVD from WellGo USA. It's directed by Olga Gorodetskaya. I'm really liking the fact that Russia has been putting out some horror lately. Sputnik might have been somewhat of a misfire, but it was still an impressive offering. I also like Baba Yaga, Terror in the Dark Forest, which I reviewed a few weeks ago, and thought it was a fun, Amblin-esque, light horror venture. Add Evil Boy to the list of decent offerings from Russia. It's nothing that's going to knock the snow off your tires, but still, I can't appreciate this attempt from a country not known for their horror. After losing their own child, a couple happens upon a feral child that has been roaming the wooded areas and historical buildings of the countryside. When they take the child in, they try to love the child like it was their own. But soon, both parents separately begin to have their doubts about the true nature of this strange young man, and as the child grows older, it becomes apparent that something is definitely not right. First off, I want to point out that Evil Boy has some rough CG moments. They are well-directed and disturbingly choreographed in terms of causing a scare or a startle, but the imagery itself looks to be animated into the frame in a very rudimentary way. Still, the scene where the little ankle-biter goes feral on random kids teasing him in the park, friends of his parents, or his parents themselves are rather shocking nevertheless. The story is your typical adopted kid horror story where one parent is attached to the child and too busy loving it while the other is suspicious about the child. It's something that's been a staple in horror since The Omen, The Good Son, Orphan, and many others like it. While it follows the story pretty much beat for beat, the film does get redundant when the parents switch their attitudes, and while the loving parent begins to distrust the kid, the other becomes ensorcelled by it. It's kind of fun to see these shifting of gears between the parents, but it still makes for some repetitious scenes. While you're not going to see anything new in Evil Boy, I will say that there's a quality in this low-budgeter. It's put together with a deep respect for horror, and actually succeeds at making some highly effective jump scares and moments of inching tension. Evil Boy is far from original or perfect, but it works more than it doesn't. Finally, we have Shortcut, which is new in select theaters and drive-ins from Gravitas Ventures. This one's directed by Alessio Liguori. A group of teenagers are making their way through the countryside after a school outing. When the road is obstructed, the bus driver decides to take a shortcut through a heavily forested area off the map. After getting lost, the group run afoul of an escaped convict with a gun and something even more deadly in the dark woods around them. Amblin-esque is a code for a group of kids on their own against a very real and terrible danger. Films like this are usually Spielbergian in nature, like E.T., Explorers, Goonies, The Monster Squad, and somehow get away with putting a cast of kids in extreme peril. None of them really dies or gets maimed, but the danger nevertheless feels more sophisticated than your usual kiddie flick. These were films that not only the kids loved, but they were well made enough for the parents to love them too. Shortcut definitely follows that pattern. While there might be a bit of harsh language and some gore here and there, for the most part this is a film that I believe a family looking to watch a horror movie together might enjoy. If you're a hardcore horror fan, this one isn't really going to have the teeth for you, but if you're looking to indoctrinate your young one into the horror genre, I think this one will do the trick. The main reason for this is that the kids starring in Shortcut are decent actors, all written interestingly enough to become invested. There's a chunk-style kid with a loud mouth and a glandular problem. There's a nerdy Velma-style brainiac with glasses. There's the misunderstood rebel kid with the heart of gold. And then there are the main two kids who are destined to be a couple if and when they get out of this and are a little bit older. All of the young actors playing these common tropes are solid and really help with the watchability of Shortcut. The plot itself is less than original and really doesn't make a lot of sense. Something about a hidden bunker, military science experiments, and nocturnal monsters. The monster's not the greatest either, but it is a practical costume, a man in a suit type deal, and director Alessio Liguori seems to know it doesn't look the best, so most of it is showcased in shadow and quick clips. Still, the monster's rough looking, and one of the main weaknesses of the film itself. But despite these setbacks, I found myself rooting for this gang of likable kids to beat the stuffing out of the monster in the end. Shortcut is not grand cinema, but it's a fun time waster with a solid cast. That'll be it for today. If you like this video, please pound that thumbs up button. Share this video with your social media addicted pals. If you're looking for written reviews, you can find them on mlmillerwrites.com. Don't forget about the new trade paperback for my comic book horror series, GRAVETRANCERS. It's out in all of the finer comic shops right now. And be sure to subscribe to this channel and ring that bell for notifications to be the first to see my future videos. Thank you so much for your time, and take care.
You're doomed.